The Wars of Religion, a period extending from 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, to 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. Now, this is a very confusing period, but the first way to organize your knowledge is to realize that there are three major wars of religion: the French Wars of Religion, the 80 Years' War, which is also the Dutch Wars of Religion, and the 30 Years' War, which is basically in the Holy Roman Empire. Let's begin with the first one, the French Wars of Religion. The first thing to know about France is that for a long time it has had a difficulty making itself a powerful monarchy. During the Middle Ages, they always kind of felt inferior to England, and rightly so, because as you can see, France is covered with lots of different principalities and counties and things like that. It's basically ruled by nobles. During the High Middle Ages, they managed to get pretty strong, but the Valois dynasty has traditionally been weak. They were the ones that lost a lot of land to the English in the Hundred Years' War, and they were the ones that the Dukes of Burgundy especially often flouted and acted as almost co-rulers. However, at the time that we're beginning right now, they're particularly strong under King Francis I, whom you see right here, King Francis I. Now, King Francis I, like a lot of the kings before him, was at war with the Holy Roman Empire, mainly for the domination of northern Italy. And in those wars, at one time, France basically cornered the Pope at one point. It would be Pope, just give me 1 second, Clement the Seventh, I believe. No, sorry, Pope Leo the Tenth. Oh yeah, here he is right here. And in one occasion, basically he got the upper hand over Pope Leo X, who had allied himself with the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire, and the two of them agreed on the Concordat of Bologna, which is going to be an important French document, the Concordat of Bologna. The basic terms of this Concordat of Bologna were that France would stop opposing the Pope and stop supporting conciliarism. This was in the year 1516. From now on, there would be an exchange. France would support the papacy at all times and not support conciliarism, the idea that the councils were higher than the Pope. But the exchange was the Pope would let France name its own bishops from now on, an idea that becomes associated with this term, just give me 1 second here, the term Gallicanism. Gallicanism is basically the idea that in France, the king names bishops. And that meant that the French kings are really going to control the church within France. This became such a deal that even entire noble families would be granted bishoprics to take care of in France, something we're going to see later. So, for example, if the king wanted to reward a friend, he would say, "Hey, friend, from now on, your family is responsible for supplying the bishops of the bishopric of blank." I'll give an example. The bishopric of Richelieu is an example, which we'll see later. But that was basically the situation in France. Now, there was a side that the French were supposed to hold. Basically, King Francis was supposed to support the papacy, and technically that meant that Huguenots were not supposed to be allowed in France. That is, French Protestants were not supposed to be allowed. But King Francis I did not enforce that because of his constant wars with the Habsburgs. Ideally, this is the idea basically. If Francis I persecuted Huguenots in France, then the Protestants in Germany would not be on his side when Francis would fight against the Habsburgs in Germany. So in order not to alienate the Protestants in Germany, Francis I had a policy of not persecuting the Protestants in France. However, this all changed in the year 1534. With an event known as the Affair of the Placards in 1534. Here's basically what went down.
Quel bon matin! Sacre bleu, c'est les Huguenots, ce ne va pas!
Okay, so basically what happened was the Huguenots left all kinds of placards in what's known as today as the Affair of the Placards in 1534. They left all kinds of posters making fun of Catholic doctrine, and they even left one poster on the king's own door. Now, this made Francis I feel very insecure, and it totally changed his mind about the Huguenots. Basically, there began a persecution of the Huguenots. It was not allowed in the empire, which is strictly what was required by the Concordat of Bologna anyway. So there's the persecution of the Huguenots. This, if you notice, is the same year that John Calvin left France. Calvin used to live in France, and he left France for Geneva in this same year, as we saw before. Now, this policy continued during the reign of Francis I, but then it also would continue under his son, Henry II, who succeeded him. Francis I died in the year, just give me 1 second, in the year 1547, and his son took over in the year 1547 as well. And Henry II was his name. Henry II continued that policy. Henry II continued the policy for a completely different reason than his father did. Henry II was losing the wars against the Habsburgs. He was losing the Habsburg-Valois wars. Basically, at this point, it would be mainly his main contender was against Philip II. That's who he was mainly fighting against. Just give me a second to undo that. I can't seem to undo that. Okay, very good. But he was mainly losing the wars against Philip II. So in order not to incur the wrath of Philip II, he continued the policy of persecuting the Huguenots, as you can see in this picture right here. At first, it was just a matter of confiscation of property, but eventually it elevated through taking away positions and things like that, and eventually even burning at the stake, as you can see in this picture. Now, this continued until Henry II died. But before the cause of his death was actually, in a way, the end of the Habsburg-Valois Wars. In the year, just give me 1 second, in the year 1559, the wars finally ended with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. At the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, the Habsburgs and the Valois finally made peace. As you can see in this picture, they're finally shaking hands, and that was the end of the Habsburg-Valois Wars. Now, that's no big deal. That's happy news. But then, what happened to the king? Well, the king, in order to celebrate, decided to have a joust. And in this joust, he himself participated. However, it ended up being his death. In the joust, the captain of his Scottish guard, Lorges, accidentally stabbed him right in the helmet. It went into his visor and stabbed him near the eye, stabbed the king in the head. And the king eventually fell down, and he died of the bleeding from his head later. So that was the end of Henry II. And that opens up big problems. Well, the main problem was that he was succeeded by his son, Francis II, whom we've heard of before. This is the sickly king. He's only 16, who was also married to Mary, Queen of Scots. Do remember that. He was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, whom we've seen before. The only problem is that Francis's reign did not last long at all. He basically died pretty shortly afterwards. He died in the year, he died in the year, just give me 1 second, I believe 1560. Yes, he died in the year 1560. And so his father died in 1559. He himself died in 1560. Now, the death of Francis II caused some problems because, as you can see, he and his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, had no children. Now, Francis does have tons of brothers, as you can see here. He has at least 3 brothers, and in all there were 10 children of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. And all these children belong to the Valois dynasty, which is the ruling house of France. The Valois dynasty right now is the royal house, so that's kind of their main power base, is that they're the royal house. But also, they are Catholic, but they're also not militant Catholics. They're basically known as politiques. That is, that they prize state order over religion. They would rather have a strong monarchy than have everybody be Catholic. But the one problem is this. The problem is Salic law. Salic law normally doesn't trace through the lateral line, that is, going by brothers on the side. Lateral means side. Normally, Salic law works in the direct line. In other words, you're supposed to go straight down. And if you follow the direct line, now just give me a second here, if you follow the direct line, then really a better claim might be had by the Bourbon House, which is down here. This is the Bourbon House. The Bourbons are basically go all the way back to Louis IX of France. If you go all the way back to St. Louis IX of France, one branch of St. Louis IX, of descent from St. Louis IX, goes down to the Valois, but the next line goes down to the Bourbons. However, there's some problem with the Bourbons. Right now, they already have the title of Kings of Navarre. Navarre proper belongs to Spain, but Gascony is still kind of their inheritance, and they just keep the title King of Navarre, even though they've really lost Navarre proper. Henry Bourbon right here was the first one to win that title as King of Navarre, and he won it through his wife, who inherited it actually, Jeanne d'Albret. That's her name right there. This is Jeanne d'Albret. But there's another thing about this house. Jeanne d'Albret was a Huguenot, and she managed to convert, that is a French Calvinist, and she managed to convert her husband to the Huguenot faith, and they're raising their son, also named Henry. He's going to be known as Henry IV, so I'll just say that now, but right now you can just call him Henry. They raised him Huguenot as well, which means they're not even Catholic. Nevertheless, they have a certain legitimacy so far as the direct line is concerned. So you have the Valois and the Bourbons. These are going to be two families that are going to end up fighting a lot during these wars of religion. But there's a third family. There's the House of Guise that you see represented right here. Their main power base is the fact that they are married into the Royal House of Scotland. That is the Stuarts. And that gives them a certain clout at the French court, especially since the Stuarts are also married into the Valois. Basically, the way it works is this. The patriarch of the house is Francis de Guise, Duke Francis. And his sister was Mary de Guise. She married King James V of Scotland. That's who that is. This is James V of Scotland, one of the Stuarts. And their daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots, who married Francis II. So you get the idea. They're also related to the royal house now, related to the Valois. But then probably their biggest strength was that they were militant Catholics. That is, they were not only Catholic, but they thought that Catholicism was something that the King of France was supposed to ensure, that Catholic legitimacy to rule, was bound up with the fighting for the Catholicism. Not wavering. Legitimacy to rule is bound up with vindicating Catholicism. And so in a certain sense, they're going to be a stronger, they have a stronger appearance than how the Valois house does. Especially if you consider this. Most of France is Catholic. About 10% is Huguenot right now. And the Huguenots are mainly concentrated in the upper middle class, and in the lower nobility. But most of France is Catholic, and this basically is a very attractive position that the Guises have. You can see it right here in this map that shows their basic power base. Let me bring the map to the front real quick. There we go. And you can see Bourbon House, of course, has its center down here in Navarre, or Gascony. And you can see their other possessions right here. There are Huguenots that are growing, but that's still only 10% of the population. The Guises really control all the main Catholic areas. And of course, the Valois have Paris, but that's about it. You can see that even though the Guises don't have a direct claim, they do have a lot of clout because of their militant Catholicism. Now, in the end, the one who eventually wins is the Valois. The Valois decide to follow the lateral line, so if you follow that, they're going to go through the brothers one by one. And our next king, after the death of Francis, who's now dead, our next king will be Charles IX, his brother. So he becomes the next ruler. Unfortunately, Charles IX is still young and weak, and as you're going to see, all three of these brothers are really going to be controlled by their mother, Catherine de' Medici, whom the name you might recognize. She is indeed related to the Medicis of Florence, and the Medicis of Florence have not been having a great time lately. So she was married to the King of France by the help of her her great uncle, Pope Clement VII. You might remember Pope Clement VII de' Medici. He was the one who got her married to the King of France, and now she is going to use France as a way to kind of glorify the de' Medici household, since they've lost their basic clout in Florence. Now, she has a bad rap, and that's true. there's a good reason for a bad rap. For instance, during her regency over her three sons, there's going to be a lot of poisoning people, a lot of political assassinations, things like that. So in a certain sense, she deserves it. However, When it comes to religion, she at first took a very politique approach, and that she basically wanted to keep the peace at first. And that's especially true in the January Edict. In the January Edict, she granted the right to Huguenots to basically exist. There was a tolerant edict, and not only that, it said they could meet in outside the cities. They could meet on Sundays outside cities, so they were allowed to do that. This was in the year, just give me 1 second, this is in the year 1562. However, that very same year, the Guises did not like this at all. Basically, here you go right here, just give me 1 second. Basically, as some Huguenots were meeting at a barn in Oisy-sur-Blaise, a party led by the Guises came and basically, let's see, just give me a second. Here's Francis de Guise right here. Massacred several Huguenots in the year 1562. 1562. This is the massacre at Oisy-sur-Blaise. That's basically the start of the French Wars of Religion, because violence has broken out. The Guises came and just killed all these Huguenots. The Huguenots realized it's time to gather up arms and defenses. So under the leadership of the Bourbons, basically the Bourbons take the lead here, but the military, they basically take turns with various military generals. The first leader that tries to protect them is Louis, Prince of Condé. He's basically their first military leader of the Huguenots. However, as the wars continue, he dies in the year, just give me a second here. He dies in 1570. Under his leadership, the wars had continued. And once he dies, his role as military leader of the Huguenots is taken over by a guy we're going to have a lot of occasion to talk about, Gaspard de Coligny. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny becomes the new military protector, so to speak, of Huguenots. Nevertheless, the war continues with much bloodshed on both sides. Now, until, of course, we get to the year 1572. There is one thing I should also mention. Gaspard de Coligny basically wins over Charles IX. He heavily influences the king, Charles IX, and influences him to help support, to make an alliance with the Dutch, who are also basically fighting their own wars of religion right now, as we'll see in a second. Now, once that happens, once Gaspard de Coligny wins over the king to the Protestant side, guess who's going to be angry? You bet it's going to be Catherine de' Medici, who now also made an alliance with the Guises. So here's the thing. This is when Catherine de' Medici basically decides no more of this nice approach. She decides to ally herself with the Guise family, and so she allies herself with the militant Catholic side. And as we're going to see, this explains her later actions, which come in the year 1572. In that year 1572, the two houses of Bourbon and Valois tried to make peace when Henry Bourbon, the kid we saw before, this is him over here, Henry Bourbon, the son of Jean d'Albret and the other Henry, married Margaret of Valois, or Marguerite, if you want to do it in the French, the sister of the kings we've had so far, the two kings. It was a very happy wedding, and it seemed that everything was going to be okay. But what the wedding did was bring a lot of Huguenots into Paris. There's lots of Huguenots in Paris at this wedding. And so tensions are high. And of course, those Huguenots are going to bring their military leader, Gaspard. They're not going to go without military support. So Gaspard himself was there. Now the wedding went without a hitch. So far, so good. We seem to be happy. However, the next day, the day after the wedding, something bad happened. Just give me a second. I'm trying to find the thing that... okay, let me just get these out of the way. Something bad happened, as you'll see here in this... as Gaspard de Coligny was walking around celebrating, or happy about that the wedding went off without a hitch. Just give me 1 second. They tried, basically, and an attempt was made on his life.
Mais, blesse mon cœur.
Okay, this was a big problem, as you saw at the end of that video. Okay, if we just back up for a second on that video, you can see that he lost his elbow, and basically his elbow, the bullet shot knocked off a couple of his fingers. You can see here. Let's see if I've got, yeah, knocked off a couple of his fingers and also smashed his elbow, but he did not die. However, the gunshot came from a house that belonged to the Guises, and so that was very suspicious. This, of course, accelerated the war, and Catherine de' Medici panicked. She's like, oh my gosh, the Guises, or oh my gosh, the Guises have attacked the house. What are we going to do? And basically she panics. This is me drawing her panicking here. She's going, oh! I make her sad. There we go. She's very sad, and she's panicking. So, according to the main theory, she ordered a preemptive strike of all the Huguenot leaders at once. And this led to the worst event in these French wars of religion, the Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Just give me a second, I gotta get rid of this big black thing. There we go. Basically, what started out as just an attempt to get the Huguenot leaders ended up in a huge bloodbath with lots of violence on all sides. The Catholics suddenly got into a big frenzy, and they started to go around killing Protestants everywhere, not just the leaders, but all kinds of Huguenots. As you can see in this picture, they ran up to the room where Gaspard de Coligny was being held sick. They threw him out the window, his body fell into the street, and immediately they cut off his head, as you can see right here. And if you notice closely in this picture, there's Catherine de' Medici inspecting the damage. 30,000 Protestants were possibly killed in this event, first in Paris and in the surrounding region. And just massive bloodshed without cause, without any reason. Lynchings, murders, men, women, and children. It was a terrible event. And it, of course, gave a bad impression of Catholicism in this particular war. It was definitely a low point in these wars of religion. Again, this was, just give me a second here, it was 1572, a date to know, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Henry himself, the guy who got married at the wedding that started this whole thing, he himself barely survived by promising to convert to Catholicism, which he promptly did. Now, of course, this massacre didn't help any with the relationships between Huguenots and Catholics, and so the war raged on. It raged on between the three families. Right now, the Guises and the Valois seem to be together, but that wouldn't always be true, especially when we went to the last phase of the war, the phase of the three Henrys, or the phase of the War of the Three Henrys. It's called that because the leaders of all three families eventually become called Henry. Here they are one by one. First of all, Charles IX died in the year, just give me 1 second here, in the year 1574, so 2 years after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So once he died, the next person to take over was his brother. His brother took over again, and that is Charles that is Henry III. Henry III representing the House of Valois, King Henry III of France. The Bourbon side, of course, is now led by the guy who just got married, Henry, who we'll call Henry of Navarre. That's his basic title, Henry of Navarre. Sorry about those two lines there. And Henry of Navarre has recently, Henry of Navarre has come back to his fellow religionists. He basically converted to Huguenots again. Even though he became Catholic, he became Huguenot again once he was safe in Navarre in the year 1576. The third side, the Guises, were taken over by Duke Henry of Guise. As you notice, everybody's named Henry at this time, it seems, who took over for his father. Just give me 1 second. There he is, Duke Henry of Guise, who took over for his father, Francis, when his father died, and became the head of the Guise family in the year 1584. Not only that, but he and his father is now the leader of the Catholic League, a league that was formed, basically led by the Guises, to fight against not only the Bourbons, but also the Valois, whom they see as weak. Basically, at this time, Henry shows himself as the strong ruler, as opposed to Henry III of Valois, who's known for his effeminacy. He surrounds himself with girly men in the French court, and he's not really fighting for the religion. Whereas Henry of Guise shows himself as the strong Catholic ruler and flouts the fact that he himself is descended from Charlemagne. So even though this War of the Three Henrys is originally about a war of religion, and you would think that they would fight the Protestants, it ends up becoming more of a war between these two Henrys, the militant Catholic Duke de Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and Henry III. This war escalates at the Day of the Barricades. This Day of the Barricades was a rather complicated endeavor to basically siphon off French support from the Dutch. The Dutch right now are in their wars with the religion with the Spanish, and right now the Spanish are also allied with the Guise family. This is mainly due to the work of the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza, whom you see right here. Bernardino de Mendoza did not really ally with the House of Valois because the House of Valois isn't particularly Catholic. He allied with the Guises, and they had a plan that would basically try to distract the French from supporting the Dutch, and also at the same time distract the English from supporting the Dutch. It was all a coordinated plan that was supposed to take place in the year 1588. The plan was basically this. Henry of Valois, King Henry III, had banished the Duc de Guise from Paris, and so he told him not to come into Paris. But the Duc de Guise came anyway, and when the king gave orders for his arrest, the Duc de Guise basically had his fellow Parisians, these strong Catholics, barricade every single street of Paris around his house. And they basically started breaking furniture, bringing it out, and stacking it all up so that the king's soldiers could not come to arrest him. This, of course, is something we're all familiar with, but it was the first time it was done in the history of France, the Day of the Barricades, 1588. Now, you might think that sounds familiar, that date sounds familiar, and that's because, due to Bernardino de Mendoza's idea, it was supposed to be coordinated with the attack on the English, the Spanish Armada. Now, that one, as you know, turned out to be a complete disaster, but both ordered the same thing. The Armada was meant to prevent English aid from going to the Dutch in their wars of religion, and the Day of the Barricades was meant to distract the French from sending their support to the Dutch as well. Now, what was the upshot of this? Well, basically, it was successful. The Duc de Guise was not captured by the king's soldiers, and not only that, the people of Paris all said, "Hail the Duc de Guise, let's make him the king." And he very magnanimously said, "No, no, no, I'm not the king. The King Henry the Valois of Valois is king. We'll take good care of him." And they basically kept the king in house arrest in Paris. Now, what was the end result of this was that the king escaped anyway. King Henry III of Valois escaped anyway, and eventually, a year later, in the same year, in 1588, he eventually called Henry of Guise to come meet with him so they could work out some compromise. And when they did, his men assassinated him. King Henry III assassinated Henri Duc de Guise, and now that took care of the Guise problem. The one Henry is out of the way. That took care of one Henry, Henri de Guise, assassinated by King Henry III Valois. However, the Valois were about to fall as well, because in that same year, in the year 1589, the next year, Catherine de' Medici died in January, so she's out of the picture. Croak, gone. But also in that same year, the Guises had some supporters, despite the fact that they're basically out of power now. There was one major supporter, a radical Dominican friar named Jacques Clement. Jacques Clement, as you can see here, he's receiving communion and going to confession before he does a daring deed. Jacques Clement requested a special audience with the king, King Henry III, and when they got together, he stabbed him in the stomach, basically assassinated the king. The king took a while to die, but here you see him on his deathbed. He does eventually die. Incidentally, Jacques Clement was eventually caught, and he died a horrible death. He was drawn and quartered. They tied his 4 limbs to 4 horses, and the horses were prodded in different directions, and they tore apart his body as they cut open his stomach, and eventually he was literally torn limb from limb. So that took care of the Valois. There are no more Valois. Their 4th brother had already died a while ago. We'll see a story about him later. And so the Bourbons now have the main claim to the throne. And so Henry of Navarre, the son that we've seen several times, claimed the throne. Henry of Navarre claims the throne of France and becomes who would become Henry IV, King of France. However, there was one small problem. He was still Huguenot. And when he tried to come to Paris, the Catholics barred him from entering Paris. And he realized that this was going to be the way it was as long as there were militant Catholics in France. So in 1593, he made a very pragmatic decision. He converted to Catholicism. He didn't want to alienate the majority religion of the country. Most of Catholic, again, 90% is still Catholic, so he converted to Catholicism. His words are famous. Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass. That's his famous line. 1593, he converted to Catholicism, and in 1594, they let him into Paris, and he became officially the king. Now, even though he converted to the majority religion of France, this was a big scandal to the Pope and to the Spanish. The Pope and the Spanish were like, a Bourbon on the throne, how can we let this happen? And the Spanish and the Pope began to offer their support to the Guises to take back the throne of France. However, this met with wide, popular lack of support in France, because even though most of France is Catholic, and this guy was, his Catholic adherence is iffy at best, the fact is Henry IV was very popular. The French called him Good King Henry. He was handsome. He had very good. He was very charismatic, and he just seemed to be a symbol for peace after these wars of religion. You can see that very well in this picture right here. Just give me a second as I make some room for me here. This picture right here. This picture that makes him look like Hercules. Hercules killing the Lernaean Hydra. That Lernaean Hydra, well, of course, the Hercules is Henry. That's Henry IV right there. And that Lernaean Hydra is supposed to be the Catholic League. So basically, he stamped out, just by his popularity, the Guises basically fall by the wayside. The Spanish support does not come, and the papal support does not come because the French side with their king. The wars are almost over. Now, with his clout, Henry doesn't forget his former co-religionists, the Huguenots. So the last thing he does, just give me a second while I make some space here. The last thing that we're going to see him do, he's not dead yet, but the big thing that he does is in the year 1598. This is a key date here. He proclaims the Edict of Nantes, which basically grants tolerance to Huguenots. They're now allowed to exist, these French Calvinists are now allowed to exist in France. But not only that, he grants them fortified cities and the right to gather arms. And all of this at the royal expense. They're basically subsidized. These projects are subsidized by the state. His reasoning was very simple. In France, it's not enough to just allow Huguenots to exist. They obviously need protection. And so they have to have the right to bear arms to protect themselves from the militant Catholics. And so the Edict of Nantes is a key thing here, both in the idea of the need to bear arms to protect yourself, but also in the Calvinist resistance theory. This definitely helps give credence to the Calvinist resistance theory, that theory whereby that Calvinists tend to have, where you have the right to violently oppose unjust rulers. I mean, here it is, the king saying, go ahead and gather arms, you Christian Calvinists. So you see that that thing we talked about before definitely is given a lot of a shot in the arm by this whole idea of this Edict of Nantes, gathering arms to protect yourselves. But for now, there was peace, and the French wars of religion are over, and they will stay pretty much the same, well, until the next king. Next is the 80 Years' War, also known as the Dutch Revolt or the Dutch Wars of Religion. The first thing to note that I want to do while we're on this picture is that the Dutch Wars of Religion are not just Dutch. They were, in effect, a kind of world war, as you can see right here in this picture that kind of represents the Dutch Wars of Religion. The milk cow, this particular picture, the milch cow is another way to pronounce it, probably the right way. This is the milch cow right here, which kind of represents these wars. I'll just start out by saying that, describing this picture. What you see here is the provinces in the Netherlands represented by this cow. But as you can see, every country is involved. First of all, there's the Dutch. The Dutch, who have a kind of republican idea of government, they're trying to control the cow by holding its horns. So the Dutch, of course, are involved with their own cow. However, everybody's trying to get in on this war. First, you have England. Here is England in the person of Queen Elizabeth I feeding the cow. She's basically giving the support. Here is Spain in the person of King Philip II trying to control the cow. Here is France, who this right here actually is Duke Hercule Francois, the fourth brother of the Valois that we saw, the one that I told you died. He was sent to try to get something out of these Dutch wars of religion. Eventually, as you see, he's getting pooped on by this cow because things did not go well for France in this war, even though they tried to get something out of it. And then down here, you have William the Silent of Orange, who becomes the Dutch stadtholder after the war. And basically, even though he's Dutch, he gets a lot of this war as well for his own personal gain. You can see that in the actual lines of the poem. Not long time since I saw a cow did Flanders represent, upon whose back King Philip rode, as being malcontent. The Queen of England giving hay, whereon the cow did feed, as one that was her greatest help in her distress and need. The Prince of Orange milked the cow, and made his purse the pail. The cow did shit in Monsieur's hand, while he did hold her tail. So you get the idea, it's a kind of world war, because everybody wants the Dutch Republic for reasons we'll see in a second. Now, to understand these Dutch wars of religion, we should go back to Charles V. You see him right here, someone that a lot of European politics is always going to go back to. Charles V inherited all these lands just as his birthright. You'll recall that he had also the Holy Roman Empire eventually, so he also kind of has this big territory in Central Europe. But we're not even counting that right now. These are just the lands of his birthright through his four grandparents. From Ferdinand of Aragon, he has the Aragonese lands, which is the great Mediterranean power of the late Middle Ages, mainly because of their absorption of Barcelona, Catalonia, which is a great sea power, and so they've also got these islands. From his grandmother Isabella of Castile, he has, of course, Castile, most of Spain. But remember, that also includes Peru and Mexico and the other Spanish lands of the Caribbean, because Isabella was the one who ultimately funded Columbus's voyage. It was under the crown of Castile. But from his father's parents, he also inherited the main Central European lands. From his father's father, he inherited Austria, the main Habsburg land, but also eventually Bohemia was married into, or not married into, but was laid claim to. And then also, by conquest in a certain degree, Hungary. So he's got the lands of the King of Hungary, the King of Bohemia, and the Duke of Austria are all his, ultimately by birth. But then also, his father's mother, it brought Burgundy to the marriage. Burgundy is right here. It's always been a very independent part of France. But at this time, they also had the control of the Netherlands. Going back to the 14th century, the Netherlands are part of the patrimony of Burgundy. And that's the main point. Charles himself was born in that area. He was born in Ghent, part of the Burgundian possessions. They were even called at that time the Burgundian Netherlands. He grew up speaking Flemish, and so he had a special place in his heart for what is now the Spanish Netherlands. These areas right here, the Spanish Netherlands. He knew, for one thing, that the Netherlands don't like being told what to do. This is not a place where you flex your monarchical muscles. And that was only confirmed by the two regents he had in place during his reign as Holy Roman Emperor. You know, of course, Charles was very busy, so he mainly ruled the Netherlands through regents. First, his aunt, Margaret of Austria, who did an excellent job. She was a very charming woman and won the Netherlands over by her charm. But also his sister, Mary of Hungary, who, though somewhat beautiful, was not as good of a ruler. But both of them told Charles the same thing. When it comes to the Netherlands, leave them alone. They don't like to be told what to do. Now, unfortunately, things went well during his reign, but Charles seemed to forget to pass the message on to his son Philip. As you remember, in the year 1556, Charles abdicated. He was worn out from wars against Turks, French, and Lutherans, and eventually he just gave up. And when he gave up, he divided his lands. The Central European lands went to his brother Ferdinand, and his Spanish lands basically went to Spanish and Dutch lands went to his son Philip II. You see that right here, of course. There's a nice picture of father and son right here that I've showed you before. Let me just get this out of the way. You see right here, there he is right there. It was to Philip that the Netherlands would ultimately go. But Philip was not as kind. Remember, Philip grew up speaking Spanish, and he never learned Flemish, and so he would never have the relationship with the Netherlands that his father Charles had. Now, in a certain sense, Charles seemed to see the writing on the wall. He knew he wasn't going to win the Netherlands over, so in 1559, he left the Netherlands, never to return. This painting shows him leaving and staring down William of Orange as a kind of prediction of things to come. Here's William the Silent of Orange, whom you're going to hear about later, and Philip's leaving, but he's like, I'm going to be watching you, dog. So he leaves. Now, since he leaves, he brings in his half-sister, the bastard child of Charles V, Margaret of Parma, to rule the Netherlands in his stead. This continues the tradition of female Habsburgs ruling the Netherlands as regents, which has been working well up to now. As a matter of fact, people point to the Habsburg regents of the Netherlands as an example of women really beginning to grow in power during early modernity. But at any rate, she doesn't seem to follow the trend as well, though, as the former two regents, because she tries to impose the reforms of the Counter-Reformation, at first in a nice way, and her main reason is twofold. One is she wants to win the Calvinists back to the Catholic faith. There's a lot of Calvinists, especially in the northern 7 provinces of the Netherlands, and why that is, it's hard to say. The upper middle class always seems to like Calvinism, and the upper middle class is strong in the Netherlands. It's definitely the majority population of the Netherlands. Not the majority population, but there's a lot of upper middle class in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, the economic powerhouse of Europe at this time. And of course, there's a lot of trade. And wherever all these things are, there tend to be Calvinists. Whether that's because Calvinists create economic wealth or because they follow economic wealth, hard to say, but the point is they're there, and she wants to win them back. Now, she's aided in this endeavor by Cardinal Hugh of Granvelle, who basically is her advisor in all things religious. But there's more to it than religion. The other thing they both want to do is to bring the Netherlands under the control of Madrid, under the bureaucracy of Madrid. So they have all kinds of new bureaucratic offices and forms and documents and all kinds of other controls in the Netherlands, basically to enter them into the bureaucracy of Madrid. Spain has been the bureaucratic powerhouse ever since Ferdinand and Isabella. That's partly how they ruled, is by creating a strong bureaucracy. But the Netherlands have always been free of that because, like I said, Charles knew better than to tamper with the Netherlands. But now these two are trying to bring it more under Spanish control so that they get it basically so that Spain gets a piece of the wealth that the Netherlands always seems to have. Spain is still in debt from all of its wars, and they want to basically milk that Dutch cow, as we talked about before. Now, this of course will be opposed, and is opposed by none other than William the Silent, whom we've seen already in this picture. William the Silent opposes all these measures at the meeting of the Council of State. The Council of State was a representative body from the Netherlands, representing all the 17 provinces. He was representing Nassau, one of the provinces in Holland, and sorry, not in Holland, but in the modern-day Netherlands. And he firmly opposed these measures of Margaret of Parma and Hugh of Granvelle. So there already was some tension, but that tension only gets worse in the year 1564, because in 1564 the Inquisition was brought to the Netherlands. The Spanish Inquisition was brought to the Netherlands in order to continue this Catholic reform and this kind of trying to force convert Calvinists now. You'll notice this is a year after Trent, so it is part of the Counter-Reformation, but now it's bringing in the big guns of the Counter-Reformation a year after Trent. And this was not met with support by the Dutch, who right now are pretty attached to their freedom and to their Calvinism. The Dutch reacted violently in the year 1566. In the year 1566, they started to tear down all the images in Catholic churches, another iconoclastic presentation by the Dutch. You can still see the effects today, like in this church of Utrecht, where, just give me a second, I can show it to you here in a second, where the defaced statues still remain. Here's another representation of them burning all the Catholic images. This is the event that basically began the 80 Years' War. Basically, the iconoclasm of 1566. The war ends in 1648, so it's not exactly 80 years, but it's close enough. This is the beginning. Now, once that happens, Philip decides to send in the big guns. So here, we'll get rid of this for a second. Philip replaces Margaret of Parma, not replaces, but sends the Duke de Alva, his name is Fernando Alvarez, the Duke de Alva, to basically impose control. He comes in with 20,000 troops to impose control in the Netherlands. He's he's very violent, he kills a lot of people, and immediately sets up what's called the Council of Troubles to try Calvinists and basically, just give me a second, I'm trying to pull up this picture, sets up the Council of Troubles to try Calvinists and basically punish them for heresy. His methods so repel Margaret of Parma that she resigns. Now, this Council of Troubles was known to the Dutch themselves as the Council of Blood, because so many people were tried and given the death sentence for just meager accusations, meager proof in travesties of justice, basically. I believe I have a picture right here. Yeah, here's basically a picture of people suffering due to the Council of Troubles right here. The thousands of them being burned at the stake. So the opposition in the war begins. The opposition is led, again, as I said, by William the Silent of Orange of Nassau, who managed to unite everybody in the Netherlands. Everybody in the Netherlands suddenly, from all walks of life, suddenly gather, and mainly their goal is to fight the Spanish. Even the sea beggars, this group of criminals who take to the high seas, are basically pirates, join in the Calvinist cause, and the Calvinist Dutch cause, to repel the Spanish. As a matter of fact, the participation of these sea beggars, who were known as criminals throughout northern Europe, repelled Elizabeth I, and she decided to withdraw her support at this point from the Dutch Wars of Religion, because she couldn't be associated at all with these sea beggars. Because, of course, we all know Elizabeth is highly above engaging with privateers. Ha ha ha, that was a joke. Now, the war continues with violence mostly perpetrated by the Spanish side, and the last straw was in 1576 with the burning of Antwerp. It's known as the Spanish Fury. 1576, the burning of Antwerp. In the event known as the Spanish Fury. This event so galvanized the opposition to the Spanish that all 17 provinces, Catholic and Protestant, united together in what is known as the Pacification of Ghent. So 1576, the Pacification of Ghent, the event where all 17 provinces decided to join forces against the Spanish. Catholic, Protestant, all of them. You get the idea. Pacification of Ghent, the uniting of all 17 provinces against the Spanish. It's represented here. If you'll notice, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Those are the 10 southern Catholic provinces, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are the 7 Calvinist provinces of the north. Now, this causes big trouble for Philip II. He's very scared, so he sends his champion, the champion that he knows he can depend on, Don John of Austria, the victor at Lepanto. He goes in to try to face all the combined forces of all the Flemish and the Dutch of the Netherlands, but he loses in his first battle ever. Don John of Austria loses against this united Ghent, and the Spanish basically are forced to leave. The Spanish have to leave the Netherlands. They basically have lost this one. The Spanish troops, I should say, the Spanish troops have to leave the Netherlands. Now, at this point, Philip realizes that his man for the job is just not working out. The stick is no longer working. Quite literally, you see, he has a stick right here. So he decides to replace the Duke of Alva with someone else, Alexander of Parma, Alexander Farnese of Parma. This is Margaret of Parma's son, but you might also recognize the name because it was the same name as Pope Paul III, Alessandro Farnese. And that's because Pope Paul III was his great-grandfather. So there's a family relation right there, back when the popes were pretty ill-behaved people. Now, Alexander Farnese tries a completely different tactic. He tries a policy of tolerance and conciliation for the Netherlands and trying to pull back from trying to control them. And that works well. Basically, the 10 southern provinces of the Netherlands reunite with Spain. They basically unite in their Catholicism and their basic willingness to work with Spain in a 1578 union that is known as the Union of Arras. It basically corresponds to the modern-day countries of Belgium and Luxembourg, these 10 provinces that are Catholic that unite. However, this makes Philip overplay his hand. He's so happy with the way that Alexander Farnese has been doing things that he feels bold enough to declare, well, now that things are working out in the Netherlands, I declare William the Silent an outlaw. Whoa, he's an outlaw now. He's basically, anybody can kill him if they want to. This, of course, does not go over well with the Calvinists of the Netherlands. So they also formed their own counter-union. This counter-union is formed in 1579, the very next year, 1579, the Union of Utrecht. It's the 7 northern provinces who at first are united mainly in their Calvinism and their desire to protect Calvinism, the 7 northern provinces. Now, at first that's about the extent of it, but they're also concerned about Philip. Philip is becoming more and more cocky, and one reason for that is in the year 1580, Philip also ends up inheriting the throne of Portugal. So if you think about it, his empire in this world is getting much, much bigger because technically he now has not only the red lands under his Spanish control, but since he's now king of Portugal, he has the blue lands under his control. Philip is getting a little bit power high, it seems, right here. And so they begin to take further measures. In 1581, the Dutch decide not only to be Calvinists, but they basically declare their independence from Spain. The 7 northern provinces, the 7 provinces of the north, declare their independence from Spain. This is a great opportunity for a lot of countries at this point. For example, France, shortly afterwards in 1583, France tries to take control of Antwerp instead, but as I mentioned before, that ends up backfiring. The Dutch basically shoot the soldiers of the Duke of Anjou, and that's why in that picture of the milk cow, they basically show him being pooped on his hand because they basically take their chances here to try to take control of the Dutch Republic, but they fail. Also, in the very next year, there's a major upset for these 7 provinces, and that is because, just give me a second here, that's because William the Silent, who we recall as an outlaw, is assassinated. He's assassinated by a man named Balthazar Gerard. Balthazar Gerard was basically a Catholic who had been working for years, ever since he realized there was a bounty to be had by killing William the Silent. Worked for years to plan this attack and eventually succeeded in assassinating. He eventually was caught and died a terrible, terrible death, even by the standards of the time, in which his own heart was pulled out of his body and thrown into his face, among other things. But at first, this seems like it's bad news for the Dutch provinces, the northern Netherlands, but actually kind of galvanizes them, and the war continues. Now, at first in this war, there is no way to match the Spanish tercios. The Spanish tercios were the greatest kind of soldiers of this time, the greatest corps. That's going to be true until Sweden comes to the fore. And the Dutch, try as hard they might, they're not going to win as long as all the power of Spain is basically focused on them. Now, this changes, though, because of the French Wars of Religion. If you recall, there was Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador to France. And if you recall, he basically allied with the Guises. And in the year 1584, he created what was called the Treaty of Joinville, which basically just said that the Spanish are responsible for providing troops to the Guise family back in France. And so a lot of troops had to leave from the Netherlands, which was very close, and go to Paris to fight for the Guises. And that gave the Dutch their chance. They basically stamped on the rest of the Spanish forces in the northern Netherlands, and in the year 1593, they succeeded completely. They basically pushed the Dutch forces, pushed the Spanish out of the northern Netherlands. 3 years later, countries started to recognize that the map was changing, and France and England in particular recognized these seven provinces as their own country. They're known as either the United Provinces of the Netherlands, or more shortly, just simply the Dutch Republic, because they no longer are ruled by Spain or by any regent of Spain. They're a republic led by the representatives from the seven provinces. Of course, the other Netherlands, the Spanish Netherlands, retain their Catholic identity and their basic control under Habsburgs. And they just retain the name of Spanish Netherlands. You can see the basic division right here in this map, which is the end result. In 1609, this situation, as you can see in this map again, I can't get it down, just let me get rid of all these words here just a second. 1609, this is the basic situation. You have your Spanish Netherlands and your United Provinces. And that year is significant because that's basically when the Spanish stopped fighting. It's not official yet on paper. For instance, Spain does not recognize the independence of these United Provinces. But 1609 is kind of the key year because now the fighting stopped. The Spanish just realized they can't control it. That's basically the year, let me write that down, that the fighting stopped between the two provinces. In a certain sense, the end of the war, but that's going to have to actually wait until 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, when it's on paper that the Spanish recognize the independence of the United Provinces. Now, once this stalemate was reached, it was a chance for the Dutch Republic to grow in power. One thing you should just be aware of is that when it comes to economics or world power status, naval power status, the Dutch Republic is going to basically be on top during the entire 17th century. And it starts right now. Once the fighting has stopped in 1609, first, both sides tried to assess the situation and try to win souls. So you see this in this painting here in the Rijksmuseum of the two sides trying to win their souls. So here's the southern Catholic Netherlands trying to win Catholic souls, and here's the northern provinces, the United Provinces, trying to win souls. And basically, the northern Netherlands become a place where Calvinists go. And as I said before, where Calvinists go, there seems to be economic prosperity. Basically, these Dutch start to find ways to make money. That's kind of their thing. They start to find ways to reclaim land and power their own country. They take care of their own country within the ravages of war. And they start to get together and form associations of business, basically, business associations for trade, as you can see in these various paintings. The main thing they begin to do is they start to put their risk into overseas empire. They invent a new ship called the Vloot, which is going to be the next kind of dominant ship on the Atlantic and Indian waters. And doing this, starting in the 1630s, after this war, they put huge risk in starting to build an overseas empire. You can see it right here. They basically start to spread all over. Their first voyage in the 1630s brought back tons of spices from India that they sold for 400% profit. And eventually, they become, again, as I said, the 17th century powerhouse of trade in the world. You can see their basic colonies that they eventually form here. The dark green is the Dutch West India Company, where you see New York and other places that you know from your American history class. The light green is the Dutch East Indies Company, where they also established various powerhouses. And the orange is just the ones that don't really colonize, but other places where they do trade. This brings a period of unparalleled fluid capital to Northern Europe, as you saw in the video with Lord Clark. And the Dutch start to become known as a place to basically speculate and make money. The upper middle class is very prosperous there. They start to build very nice houses. The houses of Amsterdam are a symbol of the 17th century patricians of this time who are just making a lot of money. That's why people go to Amsterdam, to see these nice Dutch houses. It's of course most famously portrayed in the famous tulip mania that you've all heard about in the video, where between the year 1634 and 1637, people just speculated on tulips. They became this commodity that everybody wanted, and the price rose very quickly to the point where they were basically worth a house or 3 times an average annual salary, and then suddenly dropped because the demand just suddenly dropped. But you see kind of the folly of it all. This is, of course, a symbol for folly, but it's also a symbol for free market capitalism and how it works. The laws of supply and demand, and sometimes things not following their intrinsic value, etc. You see it right here in this famous picture where the Dutch are abandoning their looms, the normal symbols of their trade in textiles, which is where they got their start, and they're all following it to get on this car, this wagon of fools that is just going after tulips. Here's another picture of a really nice tulip right here. I don't remember what this picture is. Oh, I did that twice. Okay. Now, of course, this prosperity is shown well in this particular picture right here. It's actually a picture of them celebrating their freedom in the Peace of Westphalia, but it's even an appropriate picture. It shows kind of their joy in life, their joy in freedom that brought them economic prosperity. It would make them basically the kings of economics in the 17th century. You should always be aware of that. It's one of the reasons this war was fought, and it's one of the symbols of the Dutch. Freedom brings economic prosperity. They're always been seen as a symbol of that, so you should just be aware of that aspect of the Dutch. Last but not least, in these wars of religion, we have the 30 Years' War. The most violent, in a certain sense the most complicated, but it was the war to end all religious wars. The first thing to know about the 30 Years' War is that it takes place mostly in the Holy Roman Empire, even though it's a world war where all European powers want to get involved. But you also have to remember the strangeness of the Holy Roman Empire after the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Remember, the Peace of Augsburg stipulated cuius regio eius religio, that is, the religion of the prince established the religion of his principality. Whatever religion he was, that was supposed to be the religion of the people in it. So here's the thing. The Holy Roman Empire, ever since the time of Charlemagne, was traditionally the protector of the papacy and the secular arm of the Catholic Church. It was supposed to be the vindicator of Christendom, so to speak. But now, half the Holy Roman Empire is Lutheran. Lutheranism itself represents the end of Christendom. There is no longer one political entity called Christendom. So it doesn't seem to have this notion anymore. It just simply doesn't have this notion anymore. Not only that, but the Holy Roman Emperor is not made by the, well, he is technically made by the Pope, but he's chosen by 7 electors. If you recall, the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Trier, the Archbishop of Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count of the Rhine-Palatinate, and the Duke of Saxony. Now, 3 of those now are Protestant. The Margraves of Brandenburg are now Protestant. The Dukes of Saxony are kind of the original Protestants in a certain sense. They protected Luther. And the Rhine-Palatine is also Protestant. So 3 of the 4 electors of the Holy Roman Emperor are Protestant. Can they even elect Holy Roman Emperors anymore? Does that make any sense? Well, yes, people just let it go. Just because they're Protestants doesn't mean they can't elect the Catholic secular arm ruler. It's a very strange idea, but you just basically got to realize that it's changed its definition. It is no longer really this Catholic secular arm. It really is just one more political entity, and a weak one at that, an increasingly weak one. Basically, all these people are revolting against their own Holy Roman Emperor all the time. It's just one more political thing. It really no longer has religious connotations. A great symbol of that is the fact that Charles V himself, whom you see right here, was the last Holy Roman Emperor to be actually crowned by the Pope. Here he is right here. There's the Pope, and there's the 3 archbishops, Trier, Mainz, and Cologne, crowning him. That in itself is something. As a matter of fact, that's completely against the definition of Holy Roman Emperor. It used to be the electors can only make the king of the Germans, but it was the Pope who made the emperor. Now, the 7 electors just automatically make the Holy Roman Emperor. They don't even bother to ask the Pope. Why would they? It's a half Lutheran country. Now, but there's more. The other problem was, after the Peace of Augsburg, several places became Lutheran that were afraid to become Lutheran before the Peace of Augsburg. That's one thing to note. So a lot of Catholic places that suddenly became Lutheran after the Peace of Augsburg. But also, the Counter-Reformation has been in full force since 1563. At least full force. I mean, even earlier, but definitely after Trent, it's been in full force. And because of the Jesuits, a lot of places have been becoming Catholic again. So you have a lot of switching happening. A lot of places that were once Catholic since Augsburg are becoming Lutheran. And a lot of Lutheran places since Augsburg are becoming Catholic. Now, when this happens, the Catholics tend to be nice to the Lutherans in their country. They tend to just not enforce the Catholicism. But the Lutherans know. The Lutherans tend to force people. They tend to enforce Augsburg. They tend to force people to either leave or become Lutheran. Why is it that the Catholics are nicer this time? It's probably because they kind of have the shame of the past, and so they don't want to press their luck by being too mean to the Lutherans under them. But the point is, the Lutherans also might be more scared. As more and more places become Catholic, they don't want to suddenly return to a cocky Holy Roman Emperor who decides to impose Catholicism throughout the whole empire again. So during this time, various unions form. First, the Rhine Palatinate, led by their elector, who is actually the father of this guy, but I'm going to bring him out anyway, Frederick V. His dad actually forms it, but he'll be the ruler of this Protestant union. They form what's called the Protestant Union. They formed that in 1608. Basically, it's a military union that's supposed to protect Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire. And it's led by the Count Palatine of the Rhine, Frederick IV. This is not him. This is actually Frederick V, who we'll see, who eventually becomes ruler. But the union was formed under his father, Frederick IV. Now, the Catholics don't like that. The Catholics are like, well, hey, if you go have one, we want one too. So Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria, if you know anything about Bavaria, you'll know it's always going to be Catholic. He forms the Catholic League in 1608. A different Catholic League, by the way. This is not the same as the Guise Catholic League. He forms in 1609, to also be a military union to protect Catholicism in those Lutheran countries. So you have two military unions forming during the early 17th century. That basically means that if something happens, they're ready for war. There's basically a situation of Cold War in the Holy Roman Empire in the early 17th century. Now, eventually, that Cold War would turn into a hot war, and ironically, of all places, this is going to happen in Bohemia. Now, there's a reason for that. One thing you got to realize about Bohemia is that it has a pretty strong Protestant attraction. And that's mainly because of the influence of Jan Hus. Jan Hus, if you recall, was a kind of early Protestant figure before the Reformation. I mean, he protested against the Catholic Church even before the Reformation even happened. And because of that, Protestant will always be pretty popular in Bohemia, even though it's kind of a Catholic country. Basically, their king, Rudolph II, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, eventually granted them tolerance. He basically tolerated them. You might ask why. Well, he was a Catholic, but not very. That's because he was much more than a Catholic. He was a humanist. That is, he loved art. He would even spend hours just looking at one piece of art sometimes, and he was a huge collector. He loved studying things esoteric and occult. He was kind of the last Renaissance man in a certain sense. He's known as what's called the Bohemian Renaissance. He's a figure in that movement. But it just seems he just lived a little bit too late for his time, because everybody else is thinking about religion. He's not. He's not that much into religion. The one thing he does hate is Turks. He hates Turks. But he just doesn't seem to care about pressing Catholicism. He never married as well, which means he's not really securing his own line. Basically, his whole reign, he was less interested in ruling and forcing things down people's throats than he was in just collecting art. So in 1609, he had granted the Letter of Majesty, which basically gave allowance for what's called the Moravian Church, which was basically a Bohemian national church of Hussites and Calvinists, basically. A national Protestant church in Bohemia. Now that's all well and good, except for the fact that not every later ruler is going to appreciate it. So, for example, 2 kings of Bohemia later, we have Ferdinand. This is Ferdinand right here. I'm going to go ahead and call him Ferdinand II because he's also going to be the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. And he was raised by Jesuits. Or not raised, I should say educated by Jesuits. SJ stands for Jesuit, the Society of Jesus. And he wants to bring the Counter-Reformation to Bohemia. So, he basically decides to rescind the Letter of Majesty. In 1618, he revokes his predecessor's Letter of Majesty. This makes the Czech Protestants very mad, and they threaten to displace Ferdinand, and they even invite, let me move these guys over real quick, they even invite Frederick V, the Duke of the Palatine, the Count of the Palatine region, one of the electors, and right now the head of the Protestant Union, they invite him, he's over here, they invite him to become the King of Bohemia. We'll put his name down as well, Frederick V of the Rhine-Palatinate. They invite him to come over and become the king. Now, one thing you should know about him is he is neither Lutheran nor Catholic. He is a Calvinist. He's one of the early Calvinist German princes to convert to Calvinism, and that's going to cause some problems in a second. But so far, you got some angry Czechs in Bohemia, mad at the real ruler, Ferdinand II, who are now inviting Frederick V to be their king instead. Now, of course, Ferdinand II doesn't like this situation, so he sends some regents to go into to go to Prague to talk to the Protestants and try to talk them down, to talk down the Protestant Spanish nobles and try to convince them that this is not in their interest, that he's their true king. However, the Protestants get so mad that they take the 2 regents and their secretary and throw them out the window in a famous event that is known as the Defenestration of Prague, which we'll see here in this video. So you see right there, basically, according to if we look back at that for a second, according to the Catholic version, they survived. They did survive the fall, and according to the Catholic version, because they shouted Ave Maria as they went down. But according to the Protestant versions, because they landed in a pile of dung at the bottom, which, by the way, seems to have very little support because the earliest accounts don't mention anything about the dung. Now, this event, the Defenestration of Prague in 1618, started the 30 Years' War, because once that started, especially because of the fact that Mary seemed to be on the side of the Catholics, that they prayed to Mary, and she helped them survive their fall. You can see that right here. Here they are right here. And here's the Blessed Virgin Mary, and somehow this is all these are the winds and the angels basically breaking their fall. It seemed that God was on the Catholic side, and so the Catholics get ready for war. The war, of course, is mainly going to be between Ferdinand II, who becomes HRE also in 1619. In 1619, he's going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. He's on the one side, but he's joined, of course, by the leader of the Catholic League. That's why they exist, for war like this. So Maximilian of Bavaria is involved in this war. He's also going to basically help Ferdinand as leader of the Catholic League. But other places also join in. For example, John George of Saxony joins on the Catholic side, even though he's Lutheran. Why is that? Well, there's really 2 reasons. One, let's put these guys over here for a second. One is, Lutherans at this point are more suspicious of Calvinists. And if you recall, Frederick V is a Calvinist. Lutherans don't want Calvinists to upset the happy peace that they have from the Peace of Augsburg, and so they'd rather go against the Calvinists. But also it's mainly land. If you look at this right here, remember, John George is the Elector of Saxony, right here. And part of the Palatinate's lands is right here. And so John George is hoping that if in a war between Bohemia and the Palatinate, Saxony might be able to increase its holdings in both areas and basically get a bigger chunk of land right here. So it's not purely pure interest, but what's interesting is a Lutheran is joining on the Catholic side. And then there is also, of course, Spain. At this point, Philip II is dead, but Philip III is going to help his cousin, Ferdinand II, and they're going to also send in troops. So Spain is also involved. So you got Spain, Saxony, Bavaria, and the Catholic League all going up against this. And by the way, in this phase, a famous man named René Descartes also joins the Catholic League, and you'll see, we'll hear about him later, but René Descartes is also joining this war at this point. If you don't know who he is, don't worry, you'll see him later. Of course, on the other side is the Rhine-Palatinate and the Protestant Union, led by Frederick V, along with the Bohemian Czechs. Now, this war pretty much ends in disaster for the Protestants. In the year 1620, there's the Battle of White Mountain. 1620, the Battle of White Mountain, near Prague. And that basically ends the Bohemian phase of the war. The Protestants lose, and once they do that, the Catholics get pretty cocky and they think, hey, let's move north. Let's attack northward. Now that we've basically have won the area of Bohemia and we basically won against the Rhine-Palatinate, let's move north and try to get those Protestant areas up in the north. You recall, the Protestant areas are north, but the north is also the best spot because of those maritime cities, the connection to the Dutch Republic, the connection to the Baltic states, etc. Everybody wants the north, but it's mostly Protestants. So the Catholics now decide to make a move to try to conquer more northern territory while they're winning this war called the 30 Years' War. And they start to make progress. The Catholics really do seem to have the advantage, the military superiority at this point. And here's the problem. Protestants don't want that, but neither does France. Another thing that's very important to mention about the Battle of White Mountain is that when it was over, Frederick V, who had actually been placed as King of Bohemia in the winter of 1619, was deposed again and sent back to the Rhine-Palatinate, and that's why he's known as Frederick the Winter King, because he was only King of Bohemia for one winter, the winter of 1619 into 1620. And the Battle of White Mountain returned things to where Ferdinand remained the king of Bohemia. But another thing that Ferdinand did was he transferred the electoral privilege of the Palatinate to Bavaria. Basically, Bavaria was Catholic, and its leader, Maximilian, over here, he was the leader of the Catholic League. Let's see, where'd he go? See if I can find my Maximilian. Just give me a second here. There he is. Maximilian over here was the Duke of Bavaria. He got the electoral privilege, which means that the electors have been shaken up now. Now there's 7 electors, 5 of them Catholic and 2 of them Protestant. The only remaining Protestant ones are the electorate of Saxony, whose elector right now is the guy we saw before, John George. Let's see, where did I put him? Just give me 1 second. Oh, where'd you go, John George? There he is. Here's John George right here. Just give me a second. Let me bring him to the front so you can see him. We've seen him before. He's still Lutheran. And then also the electorate of Brandenburg, whose elector right now is George William, but I don't have a picture of him, although we'll see him later. So this situation shook up the electorate a little bit. Now the Duchy of Bavaria is an electorate, but the Rhine-Palatinate is not. It might seem strange at first that France, a Catholic country, should be so agitated by the progression of the Catholic forces towards the north of Germany and over their victories, their clear victories over the Protestants. However, France is at this point not so much Catholic as Gallican Catholic, in the sense that they mainly work for France, and France is Bourbon, whereas Spain, the Netherlands, Milan, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, all these states surrounding France are Habsburg, and the basic foreign policy of France right now is very simple. Down with the Habsburgs. They're all around us. We don't want them to increase in power. That policy is mainly the brainchild of Jean du Plessis de Richelieu, a cardinal who basically rules France right now. That sounds ironic. A Catholic cardinal rules France, but you'll hear that story later. Cardinal Richelieu realizes that if the Catholics are winning and we don't want the Habsburgs to win, we need to call on another Protestant power to come to the aid of the Protestants in Germany. And when you're looking for Protestant powers, look to the north, look to the Scandinavian countries. All these countries became Lutheran in the 1520s and 1530s, and they've been Lutheran for a long time. So he calls on the country of Denmark-Norway, which is one kingdom right now, ruled by Christian IV. He basically promises, hey Christian, if you join the war against the Catholics by supporting the Protestants in Germany, I'll support you. It'll be at French expenditure. Not alone, though. Christian IV does agree, and pretty quickly the English join in the support under the person of James I, who has a bone to contend with the war as well, because his daughter was married to Frederick V, the Winter King of Bohemia, the king that lost the first phase of the war. The leader of the Protestant Union. Took a while for James to get permission from Parliament to fund the war, but eventually did, and they're funding the Danish now. Also, the Dutch Republic is involved. They also know what it's like to fight against Habsburgs, to fight against Spain. They still haven't really won their independence in the sense that Spain hasn't recognized it officially, so they also pay Denmark to fight against the Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it's all to no avail, though, because the Catholics also have their secret weapon, Albrecht von Wallenstein. He's basically this mercenary captain who's ruthless. He was actually born Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism sometime in his young adult life, and Ferdinand II hired him to lead the Catholic League during this phase of the 30 Years' War. And again, he was ruthless. He had a couple advantages. He trained a mercenary army of about 100,000 troops from all over Europe, mainly from Ireland and Scotland. So he's got all these foreign troops, and he doesn't need a supply train. He basically teaches them to live off the land, but what that really means is live off of plundering peasants. So these guys ravage the Protestant countryside in the north, on their way north to fight the Danish, to fight for the northern port cities, and they basically steal from the peasants. They loot, they burn, they pillage on the way. This will be a theme that we'll look into later of the 30 Years' War, but it all starts with him. In the end, the Danish have no chance. They enter the war in 1625, and already by 1629 they leave. That's the Danish phase. Not only that, but the Catholics, led by Albrecht von Wallenstein, actually do succeed in winning over the northern port cities. Everything looks bad for the Protestants. The Catholics are winning the north, which is typically Protestant, but now the Catholics have the very valuable port cities. The Danish have been beaten, the Bohemians have been beaten. Oh, what's to happen next? The Catholics are pretty happy. The Catholics are so happy, in fact, that Ferdinand II gets a little bold, and Ferdinand II issues what's called the Edict of Restitution in 1629, I believe. Let me just double check that date real quick. Yes, in 1629 he issues the Edict of Restitution. This edict basically restores all territory, religious territory of the Holy Roman Empire, back to the status quo of 1552. Now, if you recall, that's before the Peace of Augsburg. So in other words, if you were Lutheran before 1552, you can be Lutheran now. If you're a Catholic in 1552, you have to be Catholic. If you recall, that's before Augsburg, which means that a lot of places that held out until Augsburg and did not become Lutheran are no longer Lutheran now. There was most of the Lutheran additions to the Holy Roman Empire came after Augsburg. He's wanted to restore beforehand. Now, this actually was overplaying his hand a little bit. A couple things happened because of this decree. First of all, he alienated Saxony. Saxony, up to this point, has been fighting, on the person of John George, the Elector of Saxony, have been fighting for the Catholics, even though they're Lutheran. But this is too far. How dare you do that, Ferdinand? And so he basically decides to side with the Protestants, wherever the Protestants might be at this point. Another person who doesn't like it is Albrecht von Wallenstein. Albrecht von Wallenstein thought that was just bad policy. You got to remember, even though Albrecht von Wallenstein is not particularly faithful to Ferdinand, he is, after all, basically a gun for hire. And he values German unity more than Catholic Holy Roman Empire. He's more of a German unification zealot. And he sees that this is just causing division. And so he starts to form secret alliances with Protestants instead. He just wants soldiers wherever he can get them. He's fighting mainly for German unity. This is when bad blood starts to form between Ferdinand and Albrecht. Albrecht disses this Edict of Restitution. He's known for speaking out against it. And Ferdinand realizes, I've got a loose cannon here. Of course, the other issue is Richelieu. Richelieu sees that the Catholics are still winning. So he decides, Time to get in another Lutheran Northern European power, and that, of course, will be Sweden. Richelieu basically opens up contact with King Gustavus Adolphus II of Sweden and basically says, I will pay you 1,000,000 French livres if you join the war. This is much more than he offered to the Danish, so this is really when the support begins in earnest. Gustavus Adolphus agrees, and he's also backed by Dutch support, although the English step out of this one, because as you'll see, English Parliament has its own problems and they're not going to let the king pay for another phase of the 30 Years' War. So Gustavus comes down from Sweden, our next power. They enter the Swedish phase of the war, which begins in 1630. In 1630, the Swedish phase begins. Now, they don't come alone. In this phase, what they need is the North. And as I mentioned already, John George of Saxony is going to be on his side because he's been alienated by the Catholics. He decides to finally join the Protestant side. But they also forced Brandenburg into the war. Here's the problem. The current elector of Brandenburg is George William of Brandenburg. He's the elector, and he's been trying to stay out of the war. He's like, I don't want to fight this war. Brandenburg has no natural defenses. There's no point in us joining the war. But the problem is George William's sister is married to Gustavus Adolphus. In other words, these two guys are brother-in-law. So he basically says, you gotta fight. And so that forces Brandenburg into the war. So you have Brandenburg, which is right here. I'm sorry. Brandenburg in the war, you got Saxony in the war, and you got Sweden in the war on the Protestant side. On the Catholic side, of course, Ferdinand's still the leader. I don't know. Oh yeah, here he is right here. But Ferdinand does not trust Albrecht, so he basically fires Albrecht at this point. No more Albrecht. And he hires instead, or replaces actually instead, Count Tilly. Count Tilly is going to lead the forces of the Catholic League in this phase of the war. Count Tilly is quite good too, but as you'll see, he's no match for the surprise Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus. One thing that nobody knew is that Gustavus Adolphus came with a completely new kind of warrior to this battlefield. He had some experience in failed wars against Germany a long time ago, and basically he came with a fully trained army. As a matter of fact, he's credited with inventing the modern military drill. He had an army that surprised everyone because he had 95 different calls and moves that all of his soldiers were drilled in, and he had 3 basic advantages. One is his drilled pikemen. Everybody uses pikemen at this point. They've been doing it since the Swiss developed the idea. But his main idea is he uses less pikemen. He uses just enough and all drilled to basically fend off cavalry from his musketeers. That's his second innovation. He basically uses all all of his infantry are supplied with muskets instead of arquebus, the arquebuses, and they're all drilled as well, and basically trying to hack down enemy infantry and cavalry in timed simultaneous volleys. He also supplies his cavalry with new tactics. His cavalry also carry an arquebus, which is kind of strange for this time. Most of the time, they just carry swords and sabers. But these guys also hack down as they go with volleys of fire from their arquebuses. His other main method is to basically deploy the infantry in long lines, infantry of musketeers and pikemen in long lines, rather than in huge squares like the Spanish do. And that turns out to work well because as these guys fire all at once, it just decimates the opponents. And his cavalry also have this tactic of shoot and charge. Shoot and charge. They fire their one volley of guns, and then they charge at the enemy, which hasn't been done ever since the invention of the musket. This was outdated since the 100 Years' War, but he brought it back. He found a way to use cavalry again with their normal advantage of charging. With all these new effects, he does a good job. Basically, he wins his major battle, a major upset for the Catholics, the Battle of Breitenfeld, a massive defeat of the Catholics, and defeat of the forces of Count Tilly at this battle, the battle that will always be his greatest battle. Unfortunately, Ferdinand has no choice but to call in his ancient enemy, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Eventually, these two powerhouses of the Swedish phase of the war finally meet, and they meet at the Battle of Lutzen. At this battle, it was technically a Swedish victory because, as you can see here, the Swedes are routing the Catholic forces. The Catholic forces are retreating from the advancing Swedes. However, because of Gustavus Adolphus's tendency to always lead at the front of his men, he himself was killed in the battle, and so it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory. Wallenstein lost, but Gustavus Adolphus actually died, and so unfortunately the Protestants are losing their main hope. Up until now, they've really been losing everything. Gustavus Adolphus represented a shot in the arm, but now he's dead. Now, unfortunately, the Catholics are about to lose their main man too, because, as I mentioned, Ferdinand does not like Albrecht. He has to use him when he can, but Albrecht is getting more and more cocky. He wants German unity. He's acting behind Ferdinand's back to make alliances with other Protestants, and eventually, in a kind of Godfather-esque mass display of assassination, Albrecht von Wallenstein is assassinated along with all of his basic officials in the year, just give me a second, in the year 1633. Basically, he was actually killed in his bedroom. A bunch of troops from Ferdinand II came in and stabbed him with a halberd before he could even really defend himself, as well as killing all of the basic followers of Albrecht in all different areas around his house. So they just lost in this rather cutthroat world of assassination. The Catholics lost their main advantage. So both sides have lost their respective leaders, but here's the thing. When it comes down to it, leaderless Catholics versus leaderless Protestants is always going to tend towards the Catholics because of the fact that they have the Spanish powers on their side. And that comes to show itself at the last battle of the Swedish phase, the Battle of Nordlingen. At this battle, it's also called the Battle of the Two Ferdinands because it was led by Ferdinand III, the son of Ferdinand II, who's still alive. So he's just and also Ferdinand, the son of the King of Spain, is the son of King Philip IV of Spain at this point. These two Ferdinands, the sons of the two Habsburgs, end up winning this Battle of Nordlingen with their vastly superior forces, and the Swedish are forced to retreat from the south of Germany. The Swedish had penetrated all the way down to the south of Germany, as you can see basically in this map, because of Breitenfeld and Lutzen. The Swedes had gotten down as far as basically this much, but with the Battle of Nordlingen, they were pushed back. Now, once the Battle of Nordlingen was passed, Ferdinand feels pretty happy, Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, but he decides it's time to make peace. He revokes the Edict of Restitution, he puts things back to the way it was before the war began, and he basically makes peace with all the German territories, allowing them religious tolerance. And basically, the Germans all come on one side now. Saxony returns to the imperial side, and Brandenburg returns to the imperial side. Even Denmark decides to fight for the imperial side. Denmark has already joined the war, and the main reason there is because Denmark hates Sweden, and so it seems like the war is almost over. But then there's France. For at this point, Richelieu decides it's time to send the French in directly. Basically, all he's tried to do is support Protestant powers has come to naught. The Catholics have been too powerful, so it's time to send the French, who have been slowly rebuilding their army and making a great army after all the Huguenot problems. And so Richelieu sends in the Comte de Guebriant to enter the French armies directly into the 30 Years' War. They're mainly allied with Johann Bonnet. Johann Bonnet is leading the Swedish forces right now. The current ruler of Sweden is now Christina of Sweden, Queen Christina, who was the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus. He, of course, fought the war directly because he was a great military king. She's a queen, and she rather likes philosophy. She loves talking to Descartes and learning about the world and patronizing arts and sciences. So she's not too interested in doing the war by herself. So in the meantime, the Swedish are represented in this war by Johann Bonnet. These two forces unite. Now, of course, they're uniting partially against Germany, which, remember, at this time has united. The Civil War aspect is over. Here's Ferdinand II, the Catholic, and he has united with him now Maximilian of Bavaria, John George, the Elector of Saxony, who's Lutheran, and Frederick William, the Great Elector of Brandenburg. They've all joined together because of the Peace of Prague in 1635, I believe. I can't remember exactly the date of the Peace of Prague. Let me see if I have it here. No, I don't have the date, but basically the Germans are actually united. The point of the war is basically over. Not only that, but the Germans are even kind of semi-joined, at least by words, with the Danish. The Danish have also decided that they're going to throw in their lot with the Germans, mainly because they want to fight against the Swedish. However, the fact is the Danish never show up, and the Germans are exhausted, which we'll see in a second. This war is actually mostly against Spain. Spain, who's still committed to the war on the Habsburg side, who's now ruled by Philip IV. This is King Philip IV of Spain. And that's basically where it boils down, because even though these are all Habsburgs over here, it's only the Spanish who join. The Germans are exhausted. Now, the reason they're exhausted is because this war has mostly been at German expense. As I mentioned before, but now it's time to treat it formally, all the marauding armies of the world have been trampling through Germany, and on the way, who suffered the most are German peasants, especially Brandenburg. Brandenburg lost half its population to this war because it has no natural defenses, and since the war concentrated in the north, Brandenburg suffered the greatest. Take note of that. Brandenburg suffered the most during the 30 Years' War. There was a lot of killing, as you can see in these pictures by Sebastian de Vranckx, of just poor and simple peasants. Here you have women, there's a lot of raping and things like that. There's some rather, disgusting scenes in this picture. And of course, death everywhere. Those three pictures, you kind of saw it progressively getting worse. There's the first run of soldiers, they take your valuables. There's a second run of soldiers, they torture you to find even what little you have. Then there's the third run when there's already destruction, but they want more, and they take whatever you have left. Of course, sometimes they would come right into the peasants' houses and take whatever they have of value, billeting themselves. They get to basically room and board in these houses, and all at forced gunpoint. These peasants have no way to defend themselves. Catholics and Protestants are doing this. Here you have a peasant whose house is being burned down. Particularly famous during this war was the Swedish draft, basically just taking filthy water and pouring it right into someone's mouth, down their gullet, until their stomach burst open. For some reason, that was a particular way to try to get people to hide, to tell where their valuables were. There are, of course, miserable people left by the war. These particular etchings of Jacques Collot, the next four pictures are going to be etchings from Jacques Collot. They especially show the miseries of the war, especially how the veterans were not taken care of. They basically had to turn to a life of crime and begging. No one cared about them afterwards. There's no infrastructure to take care of. These veterans are just stranded in Germany. The mass hangings and things like that people took their anger out on, all in this case because of religion, but just a lot of death in this war. The raping and pillaging, as you see in this picture of this peasant's house. Here's the peasant himself being hung upside down and burned to be tortured for where his goods are. Let's see. You also see his wife being raped in the background here, and terrible things happening all over this picture. It was a terrible war. And here you have the peasants getting back, by the way. It wasn't just the soldiers beating up the peasants, but the peasants would form bands in the forests and come out and find the soldiers. And this particular etching is called The Revenge of the Peasants, somewhat fitting. So you see, it was a war that was very bad for the Germans. In the end, a good portion of the German population died. The highest figures I've ever seen are 11 million Germans died possibly in this war, but even the lowest figures are 5 million. And that's both due to the actual killing by the soldiers, but also to the disease afterwards, and also the witch trials. This war was a war of religion, and often when things went bad, people blamed the occult and they blamed witches. This is kind of the famous witch trials of the 17th century in Europe. It was all part of the reaction to this war. So even though the war was mostly in the Holy Roman Empire, even at this late phase, it was mainly a war, as you can see in these two pictures, between the French and the Swedes against the Spanish. For a while, the Spanish had the upper hand, and so Richelieu decided to play games with them again, like they always do. The normal Spanish, his normal foreign policy of war by diversion. Basically, Richelieu offered money to Portugal and to Catalonia in Spain. Catalonia is where Barcelona is, and one thing you can just know right now, whenever there's a rebellion against Spain, Catalonia is always going to join the rebels. Even today, Catalonia wants to secede from Spain. It works. Basically, Portugal rises up against Spain, which has been under Spanish power since 1580, and poor Philip IV has to pull back Spanish troops also down to Portugal and to Spain itself in Catalonia to fight this war. And eventually that means that at the Battle of Rocroi, the French gained the upper hand. This is the last major battle of the 30 Years' War. In this battle, it's once again a French victory. And it's not only a French victory, but it's basically the last Spanish hurrah. As you can see in this painting right here called the Last Tercio, where the Spanish tercio has basically lost. You can see the flag of Burgundy right here that represents Spain. They lost the war, and the basic thing to think of is Rocroi, or actually let me do it this way, let me get some space to write here. Rocroi in Rocroi in 1643 is basically what the Armada in 1588 was. That is, Armada was basically the end of Spanish naval power, whereas Rocroi was basically the end of Spanish land power in Europe. Spain is on its decline now, and who's the winner? It's ultimately going to be the French, as it was in the case of this war. The French win this last phase of 30 Years' War. The Battle of Rocroi is in 1643. The very next year, peace talks began in Westphalia. Peace talks begin in 1644. These peace talks continued for the next 4 years and culminated in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the war. It's called the Peace of Westphalia because it's named after a region instead of a city, because it took place in two cities, in Münster and Osnabrück, both of which are contained in this generic region of Germany called Westphalia. The reason that happened is because the Catholics didn't want to meet with the Protestants, and the Protestants didn't want to meet with the Catholics, so basically they just had to have a two-way communication going between these two cities as the peace talks were concluding. Here's a picture of it right here. This is a picture of the Münster group getting things together. Now this peace is supremely important. End of the 30 Years' War, but also it basically set a legacy for the rest of Europe. On the next slide I'll talk about what it basically did. Basic terms of the Peace of Westphalia were that Augsburg was reinstated, but with a new condition. Calvinism is included. But also, minorities were allowed to practice their religion within the realms of princes that didn't happen to hold their own religion. In other words, if you were a Calvinist living in a Catholic land, you could keep your faith. You could practice your faith privately, and also at set times you could assemble at set times according to the laws established by the prince. This is still not religious freedom, because there is still a state religion. For each one of these states, the religion of the prince is the religion of the region. But now they're tolerating minorities. Another thing is the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces of the Netherlands, and the Swiss Confederation become completely independent of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg domains. And it's now recognized on paper. And another couple things. Just give me a second here. I've got to find a way to erase the top. There we go. There we go. That's great. The other thing that came up was France got some small parts of the Alsace-Lorraine. I'll show you a map in a second. And Sweden was also given some bishoprics by France, which of course were then secularized, because Sweden's not a Catholic country, so they don't need those Catholic bishops ruling those areas. I'm sorry, I meant to say secularized. Just give me a second here. I can't erase that. Yes, I can. There we go. Let's see. There we go. Secularized. That is, they were taken away from bishops, princes, and given secular princes. As basically a reward for their participation with the French in the 30 Years' War. Another thing that happened is the Rhine-Palatinate was confirmed as an electorate, which brings the electors total to 8. And that's because during the war, something I forgot to mention in this video, Bavaria took the title of elector from the Rhine-Palatinate. That is, when Maximilian was fighting the war, when they kicked Frederick the Winter King out of Bohemia, Bavaria became the new elector. So Bavaria is really the new one, but the Rhine-Palatinate was reinstated as an elector, so now there's 8 electors. You notice they're basically 5 Catholic and 3 that are Lutheran, or Protestant, I'll say, 3 Protestant. And then finally, the 360-ish territories of the Holy Roman Empire are autonomous in their own realms. No foreign power can basically rule over them. And that basically establishes the main legacy of Westphalia, which is, just give me a second here, the legacy of territorial sovereignty. That is, which is going to be the basic way Europe's going to operate, even until now, although especially until World War I. What you're going to see now is basically, the idea is that every ruler is sovereign in his own borders. Of course, what that means now is that fighting is now for borders. And what that means is you basically have to fight. You fight to make it to the treaty, because at the treaty afterwards, you basically draw up the map of Europe after every single one of these wars, and those treaties are where the borders are redrawn. So that's basically it. There's the last thing I guess I should mention, though. There is one more, is that war for religion is passé. This is basically the war to end all religious wars. Now we're going to have a new idea of statecraft for the next couple units. That is all basically presaged by this 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia. Thank you very much. Oh wait, one more thing. Before I close, I told you I would show you what the French won in the 30 Years' War, as well as what they gave to the Swedes. So let me pull that map down. So here's the map of the situation of the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe in 1648. And if you look, basically the French gained, you can see, let's see, just give me a second while I get the pointer here. The French gained basically areas right here where you can see these small little piddly squat areas that they won in the war. So not really much, but that's what warfare is going to be like. A lot of fighting for just very little territory. And then you see these orange, just give me 1 second. You can see, just give me 1 second here. If you look, never mind. Oh yeah, here it is. You can see right here these little light blue areas that were given to the Swedish, and these little bishoprics right here. So, and there's even some other tiny ones that you can barely see. But these were given to the Swedes by the French because Cardinal Mazarin just secularized them and handed them over. So anyway, as promised, the territorial results of the Peace of Westphalia.